All right, looks like we're live. I'm here with Pastor Tom joining me tonight,
Hello, everyone. Hope that you had a good Sunday and Mother's Day.
and let me just make sure this is going, sounding okay. YouTube delay and all. Come on. All right, that sounds all right. Alrighty. Well, I did not have a good Mother's Day because I almost never do. I mentioned this last night on a stream, but Mother's Day is kind of a bummer for me because my mother is actually passed away, and without digging up too much detail about a woman that's no longer around to defend herself, I would just suffice it to say I do not miss her in the slightest. So that's the kind of woman she was. And so yeah, Mother's Day always kind of bugs me. And so Mother's Day afternoon, I got nothing to do. I figured I'd go to the comic book store this afternoon, just somewhere to go. And I forgot that here in Lancaster County, basically the whole north end of the county is a wreck on Mother's Day because this major north-south route is half closed for this weird like charity truck convoy thing for Make-A-Wish or some shit with like 500 trucks go by, and like cops have like half of this road blocked off, and people are pulling over to like it's a massive pain in the ass. And I mean, God forbid you have to go from the north end of the county to the south end, or vice versa on Mother's Day. And it's been a while too, because I actually remember years ago, the first time it happened to me, I was heading home from my then girlfriend's house, who lived way up at the north end of the county, and hopped on 222 and found I was stuck for miles and miles and miles between exits, crawling at about 5 miles an hour because one of the lanes was closed or something. And I remember it's like Make-A-Wish Foundation is the charity, and I'm just remember thinking like, what did some dying kid wish to cause a massive fucking traffic jam? Was that his last wish? They do it every year, so of course you're not allowed to say it's a bad idea because it's charity. I mean, I don't. Can't you just donate money to charity and not fucking block the road? That'd be kind of nice. Um, but I guess I'm the asshole because I don't particularly like having major roads blocked. Uh, so yeah, that's a good time right there. That's Tom. I wanted to ask you. I kind of forgot last night. What was that guy you were mentioning? He was teaching. What did you call it? Hyper grace or something?
Yeah, Joseph Prince.
Okay, so what exactly is he teaching? Like I'm not saying you're doing this, but I sometimes find that label gets pushed on people unfairly. So
All right. Well, the thing about Joseph Prince is essentially what he teaches, and is that basically if you just sort of say you're a Christian, if you acknowledge that Jesus is Lord, and maybe kind of intellectually agree with some of those claims, that it really doesn't matter what you do in your life. He'll say things like, well, it might be better if you do certain things, or worse, or that kind of stuff, but like, you can do absolutely anything that you want, and it's okay. God is just absolutely forgiven you. Don't even have to confess or anything like that. And that's it's inconsistent with Christian teaching. I mean, that's one of the things is um it absolutely basically just neglects the consequences, and the gravity of sin is essentially what he's doing here. And that's why you call it hyper grace. That's why the heresy gets to be called hyper grace, is because it's just like, once you sort of, just acknowledge that Jesus is Lord, well, then anything goes. There's no actual attempt to, there doesn't have to be any attempt to actually follow Jesus or be like Jesus. It's just, yep, I'm going to say that he's, it's quite literally get your ticket punched and you got your fire insurance.
hmm.
It's just
Well,
that
I've
they
heard
say, yes, that's the good thing.
I've heard that lumped on certain preachers when I don't think it was fair. But I mean, that might be fair regarding him because I don't know anything about him off the top of my head. But I know kind of the inverse of that is, I mean, the inverse heresy, in my opinion, is I guess mortal sins, the Catholics call them or something. I don't believe you can lose your salvation, regardless of what you actually do.
I don't believe that either. I mean, for me,
But by the
it
same
would be
token,
reflective of if you actually believed or not.
there are obviously consequences to sin, and there's your standing with God, and then there's your fellowship with God. You know, a father can be not happy with one of his sons. It doesn't mean he's not his son anymore.
True. I mean, but the way I think about it is this: like, one of the examples that I've heard, and I think I resonate with is if you had a father and a son, and let's say they were in a boat in gator infested waters, and the father's like, son, don't play on that because you could fall in. Well, the son does, and then he does fall in, and when he wakes up, he recognizes that the father, he sees his father's body on the beach, recognizing that his father gave his life for him. And sort of like, what does it say about the kid then if he just jumps right back into the water? It would show that he really doesn't appreciate or understand the sacrifice that his father had for him. And that's kind of the same thing, with sin. If it's, if you believe in that, your sin is what ultimately put Christ on the cross. I mean, the world's sin, but since it's just your sin, Christ died for you, then how can you continue to and desire to persist in that sin? You know what I'm saying? Like, and truly say that, yes, I believe this and I understand this, rather than just, I'm just kind of saying this. Again, we still continue to sin, but it's something that we're, grieved by, that we're like, no, we recognize this is not what we should be doing. We aim to do better.
Yeah, I was going to say, to some extent, we all jump back in the alligator pond.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, there's a difference between, you've done it and then you're regretting it and you're trying not to do it again, versus don't care at all, doesn't matter. It's just, again, because I've acknowledged that, okay, well, thanks God, I believe in Jesus, but so now it doesn't matter what I do.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, I kind of wanted to get a clarification on that, and I sort of forgot to jump back in. That I think we moved on to another topic or something like that yesterday.
Yeah, but I mean that's just something that Joseph Prince is kind of known for, and so that's why I was just like, I mean, again, if you listen to like clips of him, like a lot of times people will play clips on Facebook and stuff, and like it can sound pretty good taken out of context, but then when it's listened to in context, you're like, this is again, it's like, I don't know about that.
Well, there's a pastor I really like, Steve Brown. He really emphasizes grace heavily, and he's been accused of that sort of thing a lot. But Steve Brown's messages are usually geared towards people, he assumes that they are feeling guilty about their sin. That's sort of a presupposition in his messages.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's from my perspective, you got to be balanced. I mean, you need to preach on the holiness of God. You need to preach on the gravity of sin, but then you also need to preach on grace, and it's having a balance of the two of those things that make it work. I mean, if you preach on grace, eventually what you're going to end up with is nihilism. It's just going to be a more sanctimonious form of nihilism, because it's just like, well, it doesn't matter. I can do whatever because I'm forgiven. Just like well, it doesn't matter. I can do whatever because there is no God.
Fair enough. Somebody in the chat says, so much Bechtloff nowadays. Well, that's, when you have a lot of free time on your hands, that tends to happen. Tend to do more live streams that way. So we kind of were back and forth on the topic of Muslims last night a lot. And I know John Steele takes a considerably more aggressive stance than I do. But I am pretty much at a enough's enough point, and it's time to make a lot of hard decisions here on how we approach this issue. And to me, I mean, yeah, okay, there's Muslims who don't mean us harm. What percentage that is, whatever, but that's not even what I'm worried about anymore. The casualty I'm worried about in all this is just the concept of religious freedom in the West. That's the thing I got to tiptoe around as much as you can. But at a certain point, I mean, there's no religious freedom in a smoking crater. Something has to be done.
Right.
And as I said last night, I think the basic psychological warfare against them, using their beliefs against them. Drag one of their after you shoot them, wrap their corpse in bacon or something like that. And then the mosques that have suspected ties to terrorism, or in many cases obvious ties to terrorism, use some manner of RICO type law and shut them down. Bust them up. There's religious freedom. I mean, you can put a satanic temple out there. That's part of religious freedom. But the moment the FBI suspects you're slaughtering babies, they're going to go in there and bust you up. You're not a Planned Parenthood. You're not allowed to do that. Which, by the way, Planned Parenthood had a Mother's Day.
If I could just clarify from my position. So what I was initially responding to was what was it? James, the caller, when he was saying, we should take military action against Muslims in general. I guess my question is, should military action be taken against Muslims indiscriminately? In the sense that, just anybody who is identified as a Muslim. And then it kind of shifted from that to the conversation in general, which I think really was the real question is can you accurately define Muslim? And I guess I'm just of the opinion that, because I think Islam is just fundamentally inconsistent within itself, you cannot properly define it the same way that you could Christianity. Now, I recognize that a lot of people disagree with that, and they say, well, no, what you see with Sharia and stuff is the most pure form of Islam, and so these other versions here, they wouldn't actually, we wouldn't consider them Islam. But I guess I don't think that Islam is coherent enough to be able to define it in that fashion, and I think that would be one of the disagreements would be.
I don't really think it is either, to be honest. I think of all the major world religions, it's the most philosophically and feel just incoherent. And I mean, there's always any worldview has points where they can't quite square the circle. That's just kind of the nature of reality. I mean, as a Christian, you're hard pressed to explain exactly how the Trinity works, but that's a little different than a full on, you can't even sum up your religion properly.
Well, I mean, the point is Muhammad was inconsistent. I mean, within Islam, he sort of started out preaching somewhat of a message of peace, and then that didn't really work out very well for him. So he kind of shifted his tactics. I mean, again, it's generalizing and summarizing in a lot of different ways here. But I mean, that's, in a basic sense what kind of happened. And so that's where you get a lot of this confusion. A lot of people who will want to say, well, Islam's peaceful, they'll point to those texts, versus those who, want to say, well, no, Islam is violent. They'll point to some of the later texts. And, so, I mean, essentially what you have with ISIS was kind of their form of a reformation of trying to get back to the roots of Islam. And so for the people who want to say, like David Wood, I think he believes that, violent jihadi Islam is the most pure form of Islam. And again, I'm just not exactly sure if you can, define it in that fashion.
Well, I think you could argue that it is the more pure form for the simple fact that theirs has been a remarkably violent history. And at a certain point, you have to look at what the fruits of the philosophy are. And I mean, yeah, all religions have people who have done bad stuff in its name. Okay, fine. But this one in particular just really, really has a tremendous amount of it. This is, there's not a lot of good things you can point to in the history of Islam. There's just not.
And I mean, that's a fair point. Like I said, for people who agree with that, I mean, I don't think that that's an untenable position or anything. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't think it's like, well, that's just stupid or that's absurd or anything like that. I get that. I mean, again, I'm of a different opinion at this point. I could probably be persuaded if given enough evidence, but I'm just sort of, in that instance, of a different perspective. But again, initially though, I do think that it would be wrong to just take military action indiscriminately against anybody who was identified as a Muslim. I do think that would be wrong just for a plethora of reasons. But again, as I was saying, I would not want someone to do that for me in Christianity. And so I guess that's, in that sense, I would be bound to hold that same standard for Islam as well. Having said that, I do want to clarify. I have no problem with our nation or any nation saying, if you come from a particular country that's known to be, have a lot of radical jihadis, that kind of thing, saying, you're not going to come into this country. I'm not the kind of person who's like, well, we've got to let these people into our country, that kind of thing. Nor am I, against the FBI watching them and that kind of stuff. And when you look at a lot of the terror attacks in the United States that have happened, many times what you see is that, the police knew about it. They knew this individual, they were watching them, but they didn't do anything because they didn't want to be seen as racist. And to me, that's sort of where, at least in our nation, the bigger problem is this idea that, we can't talk about radical Islam. We can't, when we see somebody, when we see them going radicalized, they're not doing anything because they don't want to be seen as a bigot or racist or an Islamophobe or anything.
Yeah, that's a big problem. I would argue, though, I think Europe is rapidly reaching a point where they're gonna have to be far more indiscriminate. And I mean, it's not to say whether or not that's the best way morally. It's just, it's rapidly reaching a point where that's going to be the only option they have on the table is, if they are even able to do it, to muster up the will to just say, all right, you all got to go. I mean, just a full-on civil war where one side is driven out. If not,
and so I guess my question here would be is, what would the sides be like if you had to define the sides? I guess how would you define the sides?
Well, again, I mean, you take your average country in Europe, and this would require a sudden, resurgence of balls and a backbone. But like France, for example, I could see a scenario if France ever came to its senses where, a sizable chunk of French people, nationalists, probably largely Christian, at least nominally so, just say, okay, Muslims got to go. And usually in a civil war, I mean, you say sides, and you like to imagine in your head a civil war is this true 50-50 thing, when a lot of times civil war is about 5% fighting 5% with the other 90% caught in the middle.
Right.
That's usually how that goes. I mean, our own revolutionary war in this country was fought, but with 5% of the population.
I don't know. I never.
It was an incredibly small percentage where, most people just, wanted to keep their heads down. Because it's just the nature, most people just want to take care of theirs.
Well, I mean, it could be, and I mean, I'll definitely say this. Like, when it comes to ISIS, I mean, I definitely think we need to have the approach to ISIS the way, like, have you ever seen Tombstone?
Mm-hmm.
Like that, the same way that Kurt Russell had with the Cowboys. Like, that's the approach we need to take with ISIS. If you're identified with ISIS or anything, you are going down. You need to, absolutely just deny that you were with them. So, I mean, when it comes to that, absolutely. And, militarily and that kind of thing. And yes, ISIS needs to be wiped off the face of the earth. Absolutely. In terms of Europe with this kind of thing, I mean, I hear what you're saying. And I mean, it's a fair point, and I'm perhaps not as versed with the European situation as the American situation. So, but it could be that would be the case, and so there would be a lot of people. I guess I would say is, so what would you do with these people that are caught in the middle, though? Like what do you do with well, I mean, or number one, let's just say, someone who's not even a Muslim, but they're, sort of sympathize, and they're like, well, I don't think that we should get rid of the Muslims. I mean, do you sort of imprison them, kill them? I mean, just leave them alone, just say, well, stay out of our way. I mean, there's all kinds of questions when you start to talk about
generally speaking. I mean, in the hypothetical situation where I'm suddenly in charge of the one side of the French Civil War for some odd reason,
Viva de Bechtloff.
Yeah, they decided to pick an American of German ancestry to lead them. That seems kind of odd, but okay. Honestly, yeah, at that point, if you're left with no point, the Muslims got to go. And as for, Frenchmen that stand in the way, I have a bit more contempt for a traitor than an enemy.
Right.
I Maybe that's a time to dust off the guillotine. I don't know. Um, I, I mean, like, let me put it this way. If I was German, I mean, I have mostly German heritage. So if I was a German man right now, I would want the Muslims gone. I would want Merkel drawn and quartered. Like, that's the difference. So as for, people who get in the way, I mean, keep your head down. And if you get in the way, you get in the way.
Right.
I have a great, like, honestly, Islam shouldn't even be that big of a problem in the West. Um, I mean, at some point you do got to back up and say, to some extent, I mean, it is the left that is a bigger problem. You know, Islam is something we should easily be able to deal with in the West, but we can't because of leftism. Leftism is the AIDS. I can't talk to.
Immunization.
Yeah, the immune disorder. It's the AIDS that is preventing us from fighting off the flu of Islam. Islam is something that basically law and order, a firm law and order should be able to keep, most of them out. Certainly the worst of the worst would be dealt with any kind of firm cultural, foundation, any kind of firm sense of law and order. Most of these people would be able to be dealt with pretty quickly. But we don't have that anymore because of the left. So, I mean, in some regards, I don't like the refugees that come over here and shit up the place. But those morons with the you've probably seen that iconic picture of those stupid teenage girls with the refugees welcome banner and crap like that. I have far more contempt for them, and I outright despise the adult leftists who filled their heads with that kind of poison.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No disagreement. It's kind of getting back to the other topic though. I guess one question would be is, what if you are just a proposal, I guess, what if perhaps instead of the line is, European Christian versus Islam, what if it was more based around ideas like, you either, if you don't acknowledge these particular values, then, get out of our country versus if you, if you are a Muslim or you're a Christian or something like that, right? I mean, wouldn't that kind of address the, leftist problem in a sense as well?
To some extent, yeah. I don't necessarily know that you can really get people to rally around that anymore. It's far easier just on human nature to get people to rally around an identity than an abstract idea. Whether that's right or wrong isn't the point. It just is. And generally, people will rally around racial identity, failing that, a religious identity.
So I guess your point would be is that Europe is at the point to where we can no longer, or they could no longer afford to risk, something that's maybe a little bit more abstract. They need to rely more on what's pragmatic.
I would say the nations of Europe have to choose between being, I mean, not exclusively, but fundamentally white Christian nations, or they're going to be, Islamic. They're going to be, France Stan or whatever. That's the choice right there. You have a choice between being what Europe was hundreds of years ago, I guess, or falling to this kind of Islamic globalization kind of sort. And when I say white, I don't mean like every single non-white is thrown out. I would look at it more like, say, Japan. Japan is mostly Japanese, and Japan remains mostly Japanese. And culturally, yeah, you're welcome to live there if they allow it, but you're not Japanese.
Right. You're always a
there's just you're. In other words, the West kind of has got to abandon this idea of the immigrant, and replace it with the foreigner. Now, some foreigners are welcome in your country, and some aren't. but they're pretty much just a foreigner. Um, I mean, it's a little different here in America because we are a relatively young country, you know,
Right.
that you could argue hasn't gelled quite yet, as at least as much as the countries of Europe. But with Europe, where you're dealing with centuries and millennia of history, you know, yeah, at a certain point, you got to be like, okay, these are the Europeans and these are the foreigners. And some of these foreigners, they're very welcome and we're happy to have them. Some of them, not so much.
But I
And
mean,
be it right or
again,
wrong,
from
I
my
just think those
perspective,
are the
wouldn't it be
options.
easier to address that based off of what values and virtues they hold versus, like just the particular, I mean, again, like I'll continue to assert this. I think I'd have much more in common with, like, say, someone who was black, but, like, thought that the family is good and, thinks that being a father is good and is a Christian, rather than someone who's white and is, a atheist, nihilist, whatever,
Oh,
pansexual.
I agree with you, and I've said that numerous times on here, and that's part of my problem with the alt right is that race matters, but it's not all that matters. And I far more am likely to identify with a black Christian than TJ and his bunch of bananas. What I would say it would be nicer, but I don't think it would be easier. I'm not saying that like this is what should be happening. I'm saying I believe these are Europe's two options.
I got you.
I'm not that's not a statement of what I want. No, what I want is I would be happy if the whole world was nothing but a pure meritocracy. Um, but that's not how it is, and it's not how it's going to be in Europe. I believe those are Europe's two options. Um,
So
for
essentially, I
better or
mean,
worse.
this is more like the guy's in the house. You either kill him or he's going to rape your family.
Yeah. I just think, look, there's not time for, you know, Europe doesn't have time for a lot of the nicer options anymore. They just don't. Um, and whether or not they're gonna take, I think the better option is to be, to remain European. I don't know if they'll take that, but to remain European in a meaningful sense, or to become, you know, an extension of the Middle East. I believe those are Europe's two options. And I mean, you mentioned like somebody believes in the family and all. I will say that it is that belief in the family, it is that religious identity that will allow them to pick the better of the options. The countries in Europe that likely will have a future going forward are the ones with more traditionalism and more religiosity about them and more Christendom still left. Countries like Poland and stuff like that, as compared to countries like England, where, yeah, Christianity is officially the culturally dominant religion, but it's been dead for, generations.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, we touched on that yesterday. I mean, secularism is so rampant, and that's why they can't stand up to this. Is because it's just secularism can't stand up to something as dogmatic as Islam. I mean, even Richard Dawkins had to admit that Christianity was a bulwark against something that was, worse. Um, and again, just so and they're trying to, they tore down one wall, not really recognizing why it was up. Um, basically, just as a middle finger. Um, so, but again, I think my whole point here is, and there's thinking about pragmatism, and I'm tracking with you. I'm just going to play a little bit of devil's advocate too. But my whole thing is, Christianity is essentially, I mean, it's a faith, but it's also, an idea of it's an idea in that sense. I mean, in a basic sense. And, Christianity is something that I've always said is it transcends race, it transcends borders and that kind of stuff. That's why, if you've seen Christianity, it's sort of moved around, it's been prominent in this area, then it's been prominent in this other area. And then, and that's the thing. It's not really ever been limited to just one section of the world, and that's a little bit different from other religions, like particularly Islam, which is, pretty much up until Europe, has predominantly just been mainly in the Middle East, And so again, that's where I'm just wondering, is it not better than to push many of those ideas and say, okay, here are the values that we agree upon, here are the thing, here are Western values. These are what we agree on. And so if your beliefs are going against those values, then that's where the dividing line is, then you have no business being over here. And would that not be a little bit better? Would that not create a bigger tent and be able to get more people on board than just saying, you're either, Muslim or you're white Christian? You see what I'm saying?
Well, I think the adoption of Western values is going to be, where again, if Western nations, if European nations can pull themselves around, turn themselves around, I think the adoption of Western values is going to be the litmus test of whether or not you are a foreigner in this country that is welcome, and or whether or not you need to get out of here. But again, I don't, I don't. Like I said, I don't think race is all that matters, but it is something that matters. And I mean,
Well,
I can
sure. I
move
mean,
to
I recognize
France.
that. I mean,
I can learn French. I can, act with French culture, but I'm not French. You know what I mean? Maybe down the
yeah.
line, my children or grandchildren will be at least mostly French, but I'm still going to be that guy that moved to France. And likewise, this nonsense where they you point to a mosque full of a bunch of Middle Easterners and say, "Oh, these are French people." Why? Well, because they were born in France. Well, I mean, I could have been born in an aquarium. It doesn't make me a fish. It there's something more than just what patch of land your mother was standing on. I could, a white woman can go over to Japan and have a baby there. It doesn't make it Japanese.
Right.
There's a certain identity at play there.
So at this point, it's seeming more like where the issue would be is sort of the difference between ethno-nationalism versus civic nationalism.
Yeah, and I don't think Europe needs to go to any kind of extreme form of ethno-nationalism, but I think they kind of, just the nature of the threats they face, if nothing else, they kind of need to adopt some form of it. Um, at least, a relatively mild form of it.
Hmm.
And
See,
I
I
mean,
think,
there's certainly the argument that, look, every people on the planet deserves a homeland, and I think white people do too, and I think it should be the nations of Europe. That's, there's a moral argument to say that Europe belongs to white people, in the same way that Africa belongs to, or sub-Saharan Africa belongs to blacks, or the Isles of Japan belong to Japanese people. There's a certain moral argument that is their land. And to attempt to usurp them from it is kind of an invasion. It's colonization. It's all those things that we in the modern world look down on now, don't we?
so. I mean,
So
would
there's
you
certainly
would
that
you have
argument.
then agreed? Would you agree with those then who view the United States as occupied territory in regards to the Native Americans?
Well, no, because I mean, they were conquered. Whether or not conquest is a good thing. I mean, we generally try in the modern world not to do it, but whether or not it's a good thing or not, they were conquered. And I will say
Oh,
also, in all fairness, the East Coast we bought fair and square. So if they have a little seller's remorse there, that's not our problem. And also, in all fairness to the quote unquote mistreatment of the Native Americans, I mean you know they were treated incredibly well compared to other similar instances throughout history. I mean, they have reservations. Not a lot of wars end with a loser getting a consolation prize. Um, so yeah, you can argue that maybe the white man shouldn't have taken the Native Americans' land, but we did, and it's done. Like, this is something that's happening now, you know, and I would argue that Europe has every right to defend itself and to chase these invaders away.
okay.
If they
So I
fall,
mean,
they
I
fall. I
think
mean,
at that point we'd have to sort of move to then to like more survival of the fittest, like if Europe is, strong enough to survive, then it sort of has the right to survive, versus if it's not, then it becomes conquered.
Well, I mean, there's rights in a moral sense and there's rights in a pragmatic sense, I guess. There is the sense of, you you have the rights you're able to defend or willing to defend is more often the case.
Right.
And yeah, there's the moral sense. And it's for the Native Americans, again, you know, it was done. But I would argue that, that's something the United States has more than we've more than made up for that with um how we've treated the Indians in the last, I would say, 100 years. Um, most times the a conquered people is basically just slaughtered. This
I mean,
time they were
sometimes. I
given
mean, they're also
specific kinds of
assimilated
land.
further into the culture. I mean, Rome was pretty good with trying to assimilate conquered peoples into their nation.
Um, yeah, Rome was pretty good with it.
Babylon, I mean,
But
in a
again,
similar way. I mean, that's the whole point of the Book of Daniel, is they were trying to brainwash them to further assimilate them into the culture. But you're right. There are a lot of people that just go ahead and slaughter. Once you're conquered, well, you're dead.
but yes, I believe that, Europe has a right to defend its European identity. It has every right to do so.
See, I think for me, I would more recognize it. I don't know. I don't approach it from that way. I would just say that there is value in Europe's identity, and so that's why it should be. It's not like they have some sort of intrinsic right to defend it just by virtue of existence. It's rather, no, what Europe has traditionally stood for and that kind of thing. Maybe not so much now, given how much craziness you see there. But in the past, at least, there's been a lot of good that's come from that. There's so those are good ideas that came out of Europe in some sense. Now, again, just work with me on that, because I know there's a lot of crazy crap that came out of Europe too.
Oh yeah, well, no, the influence Europe has had by and large on the world has been positive. I would argue the influence white people have had by and large in the world has been very positive. Um,
Right.
White people have no unique crimes. We have plenty of unique accomplishments.
I guess, and Chris,
Um,
see, that's the other thing, is I would make a distinction between white people versus, I guess, a nation. Like, I think white people, just, I mean, like all peoples, I think they would have this sort of in a moral sense, maybe not in a pragmatic sense, but in a moral sense, I would say that they have the right to existence.
oh, I don't
Um,
dispute that. No, all people have a right to their existence, to self-determination, to you know.
I guess I'm just not as much of, like, people have a particular right to a land. I guess, I mean, if they're willing to defend it, and, like, I mean, again, does Europe have the right to defend its heritage from those who are trying to change it? Absolutely, I agree with that. So I have no problem with them doing that. I guess the question here, though, is the situation is a little bit different, right? Because it's and how they're addressing, I guess, and trying to figure out who the enemy is, though, who the invaders are, I think, is kind of where we would sort of need to find the question. And I mean, on the one hand, it seems very simple, but then, it's like, well, obviously it's those who are trying to change the culture.
Well, simply put, I mean, again, the real enemy is the left within it. If Europe was able to just, have some manner of revival and shift back rightward, then a lot of these other things would sort themselves out. Um, they just would tend to. Um, so yeah, I mean, in some sense, far worse than the invaders is the ones opening the gates.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think, if we would clean house, I mean, the same thing in America. I mean, I've already noticed a little bit of a shift since Trump was president, just because of the fact that Trump will actually call it, radical Islamic terrorism, which again is something that the previous administration didn't do, which I think more emboldened them. You know?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, same
absolutely.
thing with the Antifa stuff. When they feel like they can get away with it, and they're not going to be held accountable or anything. That just empowers them more to continue to do it. And so with Trump saying, this is radical Islamic terrorism, again, I think that'll make police officers and the FBI agents, all the people investigating. Okay, we can actually address this. We can do this without having fear of being punished by the administration, which didn't exist before. So I mean, if nothing else, I think that's another positive effect that Trump has had.
Oh yeah, I would agree with that. By and large, I think Trump's presidency has been positive. There's certainly things that can be pointed out that he isn't doing right, but by and large, I'm quite happy with how things have turned out, and it's obviously better than the alternative.
Oh
Um,
yeah, no doubt in my mind. So yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that. I think Trump, yeah, he's inexperienced, but I mean, we knew that going in. And I just
yeah,
think a lot of the things that have happened are been more from inexperience rather than just like something else. You know what I'm saying?
and I think part of it is to accomplish what he seemed to be setting out to accomplish. He's got to do a lot of house cleaning. He's got to get a lot of men in position before he can really make a move on a lot of things. I mean, you had half this government, openly fantasizing about assassinating this guy when he was in office, when he first comes in office. So, he obviously needs to do some house cleaning before he can get any real thing, anything really done. He was talking about shutting down the Ninth Circuit, uh, disbanding it or whatever. I think that's certainly something to be done if it can be done.
Yeah.
Um, he fired Comey. That's, you know, there's probably hundreds of people at the FBI he needs to fire, if not at least dozens. Same with the Justice Department, the DOJ. He needs to
Oh, absolutely.
clean house there. Absolutely. Basically anyone Obama appointed needs to be in the unemployment line. I mean, I wouldn't need to check your record beyond that. I'd be like, oh, you're Obama appointed? Yeah, okay. It's, thank you for your service. Doors over there.
I wouldn't
Hang
say
out your
thank you
desk.
for your service.
You know, it's it was like that Simpsons bit where it's like, that's it after 30 years. Goodbye and good luck. Oh, I don't recall saying good luck.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, like I said, yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I've always had maybe the opinion maybe Trump could be the kind of person who doesn't accomplish a whole lot other than house cleaning. Like maybe he's the individual that goes in and does clean a lot of house, and then you have somebody else who comes in that can actually work with what Trump put in there. But because he's kind of having to be the bad guy, he doesn't get as much done. But then when you have somebody else come in, he can be the good guy, but he can do that because of what Trump did before him. You know what I'm saying?
I realize a lot of people think it's far fetched, and I know he's backed off, but I think it's may just be because he has to until he gets his people in. But I really think he needs to prosecute Hillary Clinton and possibly Obama, but at the very least Hillary Clinton.
No,
And
I agree with that.
there's almost kind of a spiritual dimension to this, where it's like, you know, either she will pay for her crimes or this nation will pay for her crimes with interest. But the payment has to be made here. Back during Watergate, Nixon was pardoned. Nixon didn't do a fraction of what Clinton did, not you know a tenth of a percentage point as bad. Um, but he did do something wrong, and he needed to be held to account. And by pardoning him, you basically cemented that saying of his that when the president does it, it's not illegal. Or in this case, the wannabe president, the State Department head. Um, but yeah, what that woman has admitted to, never mind what we think she did, is enough that she should be in prison for the rest of her days. Not that that's particularly long. Um,
Well, and I mean that's the whole
and
thing with like
it needs
Comey.
to
That's why he
happen.
deserved to be fired because he essentially came on and admitted that she broke the law, but we're not going to prosecute her just because lol.
Yeah, I'm not going to prosecute her because I don't want to mysteriously commit suicide.
Right. I mean, so yeah, he deserved to be fired. I mean, if nothing else, that would be the reason why he would deserve to be fired above anything else, at least as far as we know.
And he's kind of kept quiet too, so I think he's just going to go away.
Yeah.
He probably knows what's best for him there.
But I mean, and again, and the other thing that I didn't say, yesterday that I really wanted to is again, I mean, and this will be coming from a pastor, of course, and just from someone who's Christian. But I mean, again, I think, and I think this is also where I come from as well, is trying to get in a position to where you can try to talk to people, because ultimately to share the gospel. And I mean, if you really wanted to see change from my perspective, that would be how it would be done, is by, these individuals who are once, death worshiping psychos to receive the gospel. And again, I recognize that a great many of them will not, but there could be some that are. And so that, wanting to pursue that, wanting to see that happen, I think is a good thing. And I know there's a lot of people who could be like, well, you're just naive, or, it's just whatever, that's a fanciful dream. But again, I think, God can save to the utmost. And so that would be the true of even those who are in Islam. And one of the nice things, of course, is we are seeing a lot of Muslims coming to Christ, who are converting, who are leaving Islam in the Middle East. So, I mean, if nothing else, that's a good thing that's come from that.
Oh, well, I wouldn't disagree with that at all. I would just, I mean, you do have to have a certain pragmatic approach where, I mean,
well, right. I mean, I think that's the balance. And I mean, too many Christians are far too willing to be a martyr versus recognizing that you can't share the gospel with your head cut off.
Exactly. So, I mean, there's a balancing act to be had there, but moving on to a slightly different topic, I was wondering what your thoughts are. Trump signed this executive order recently where he kind of restricted a very long-standing restriction for churches tax-wise. As I understand, for churches and ministries to maintain a tax-exempt status before this executive order, they were not allowed to endorse candidates. They could take positions on political issues, but they could not say, they couldn't have said in November, vote for Trump, don't vote for Hillary, kind of thing.
Yeah.
They could have said, they could have said, vote for, these are the issues you should support, vote accordingly. Which is, it's damn near the same thing. I almost wonder, what that rule even hoped to accomplish. I mean, saying vote for the pro-life candidate, for example, is basically the same thing as just naming which one of them was pro-life. I mean, if you say vote for, you should vote for the guy that's pro-life. And by the way, Joe Smith is pro-life. I mean, that technically gets around the rule, but it's sort of the same thing. So it's almost a foolish rule for the simple fact that it means nothing.
Well, that's kind of my whole opinion on it. I mean, it's kind of like, I mean, honestly, the Johnson Amendment really wasn't all that well enforced anyway. I mean, I think there was maybe like one case from it, if something like that. I mean, not very many. So a lot of people really, like I said, it's one of those things that wasn't really all that much enforced. And like you said, there really isn't that much difference anyway. I mean, churches are given a lot of leeway. So the executive order, I don't know. It's kind of like, here's a bone, but there's no meat on it. Like, from my perspective, I would have liked to have seen Trump really take a stand more on some religious liberty issues and really try to clarify some things, for religious people, and, making sure that, we're actually able to practice our religion. I mean, so again, I do not think Christians should be forced to bake a cake for a gay wedding if they don't want to. I think that should be a freedom that they should have because of their religious liberties.
I think where a lot of us Christians are failing on this is, I would argue that's not even a religious liberty issue. I would argue what we need to be focusing on here is there's a principle of the right of freedom of association, and that's what we should be arguing for. Basically, by making it about religious liberty, we're basically saying you don't have the right of freedom of association. We just want to have an exemption. And I've actually heard, say, Glenn Beck, for example, argue that, where I'm like, well, I'm not saying you should be able to discriminate on race. I'm just saying we Christians should be allowed to discriminate on this or that bounds because of our religion. Well, no, you need to go back and, I mean, I was, remember in high school arguing with a conservative teacher of mine who I used to, occasionally I'd be in detention and arguing politics with him. And I just genuinely enjoyed it. He was a very sharp guy. But anyways, and I said to him, I was like, you realize, because I was arguing that, this Civil Rights Act, even back then, I was like, that just, it ruins the right of freedom of association. And I was like, one day, and I used the example, I was like, maybe they'd make you hire a gay nanny for your kids or something like that. But, you're going to say, no, I don't want to. And they're going to say, no, you don't have the right to make that decision anymore. And sure enough, in one form, that day came. And the reason that Christians lost that battle was because they lost it in the 1960s. They lost it before they knew it was a fight.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, I would definitely say, yeah, I agree with you in your point too, to where it is more a freedom of association issue as well. I mean, again, I think it is a freedom of religion issue at this point, but I definitely agree with you with going back even further. And I think that's where a lot of Christians were operating from. Okay, this is the law now, so we're trying to operate with what the law is rather than trying to change it. But no, I agree with you. I think people should be allowed to associate with whoever they want to, and likewise should not have to associate with people that they don't want to, and shouldn't be forced into servitude of anyone. I mean, and so I absolutely agree with that. The one exception I would make, of course, would be in regards to those who are physically disabled in some form or fashion. I think that businesses should have to make accommodation for them, again, because of their physical disability. But there's a clear distinction, I think, that can be made between physical disabilities versus, say, race, religion, or sexual orientation or gender.
See, I would fight you on that because, I mean, you're basically arguing that someone, I mean, you end up with rules like we have now where someone has to build super expensive wheelchair ramps on the off chance that a guy in a wheelchair is going to come in.
I think that's appropriate though.
Yeah, but I don't think that's I mean, a lot of small businesses maybe can't afford that. I don't think that's something. I think that's something that should be left to the businesses. I don't think they should be forced to spend exuberant amounts of money on the off chance that they might be accommodating somebody.
Well, not exuberant amount of money, but I mean, wheelchair ramps are not incredibly expensive. I mean, yes, there's certain things that you have to do with the code and everything like that, but I mean,
I think most businesses are just going to end up doing a lot of that stuff anyways.
And that's fine. I mean, again, if you wanted to say, well, we could leave the free market to it, but I mean, again, I do think that I also recognize a certain level of greed that people can have with that as well. And so there's a lot of businesses say, well, we're just not going to serve physically disabled people and they can just deal with it. And yes, you could say that there are businesses that would rise up and say, well, we are going to serve them. Here's the market here. But then you got to ask the question, well, how big of a market really is there for physically disabled people? Is it big enough to sustain itself? Which I don't think it is.
I really don't think most businesses would be foolish enough to say, fuck the guy in the wheelchair. Because that's just a PR nightmare.
Well, but no, they're not going to say that, but it's sort of, but I mean, I don't think it would be phrased in that way. It'd be like, okay, do we spend, whatever, $100, $150, $500, whatever it is, $1,000 to make accommodation for them or not? Well, no, we're not going to do it if we don't have to.
Well, I mean, I'll give you an example of where, it would be just exuberant. I used to work at a Halloween show, and I mean, you couldn't send a wheelchair guy through the haunted barnyard. You just couldn't do it. There's moments in there where you got to climb stairs. I think at one point someone did go through in a wheelchair, and he was told point blank, like, "Look, you're only going to be able to do half of it." And the guy's like, "Oh, it's okay, whatever. I'm hanging out with my buddies. I'll just do as much of it as I can." I mean, he was cool about it, but I mean, to imagine some government agency go in there and, what are they going to say? Like, okay, we're going to shut down the upstairs of the barn because this one guy wasn't able to do it. Or, we're going to demand you build a wheelchair ramp into your haunted barn. I mean, again, that's just something like leave common sense to prevail in that. And I can't imagine the government bureaucracy. And you know what? Probably if that guy would have sued Jason's Woods, he might have won the place I used to work there. He might have won. He might have been able to shut down that whole attraction. And I mean, what good is that to everybody? I mean, I'm sorry you're in a wheelchair, but and again, he was cool about it. He understood, the world's not fair sometimes, but that was common sense prevailed, thankfully. But I highly doubt the law would have fallen on the side of common sense there.
Well, right. I mean, of course, again, I think that illustrates a problem with the legal system in general of these people suing companies for, exuberant amounts, which is stupid. I mean, that's ridiculous. It doesn't need to happen. I mean, I remember someone who was in a jury case and they were in a wreck, and the person's like, I think it's fair that this person should have to pay $7,500,000. It's like, really, for a car accident? I mean, just why don't you just say $1 million at that point? If why we're just making up magical numbers here, for what you think you're going to get. And of course, at the end of the day, that person didn't end up getting anything. Um, but again, I mean, I see what you're saying. I kind of gone back and forth on this. Right now, I'm kind of the position that I feel like that's one of those areas to where there should be some government regulation. But I think it's a fair point to say, of leaving it up to the free market. And so, if it happened that way, I wouldn't be upset. I guess, if the free, if the laws changed and it was a much more free market, it wouldn't bother me per se. But just as of right now, I do feel like, yeah, I think we could. I don't think it would be as harmful to have some government regulation in that area. You know what I'm saying?
I understand. I just think it's kind of it's kind of one of those things where you end up down this sort of slippery slope where we are now. I mean, generally speaking, I just feel like a business owner should be able to do business with who he sees fit, and you know, it may not be in his best interest to be able to accommodate certain folk, and you know,
Well, I guess you could try to put a provision in there about something that would cause undue burden, and so that way it could be a little bit more case by case basis, so then we could define sort of what is an undue burden, what isn't. I mean, I don't think putting in a ramp in many instances, is an undue burden. Obviously, there are some cases, like for our church, the way that it's built, we have a lift, an elevator lift, because the way that it's built, we couldn't ever put a ramp in reasonably. I mean, it would have to circle the church like 3 times in order to be within code. But we do have that lift there, and so we're able to, accommodate people in a wheelchair with that.
yeah. I mean, but again, there's certain times. I mean, another example in my area, there's a little comic book store that's only open on Saturdays, run out of the basement of a church, and I mean, you go down these little stone steps into this church, into this basement. It's one of those kind of openings to a basement sort of thing, and I mean, there's no way you could give any kind of wheelchair access to somebody there. I mean, you'd be foolish to try and get in there if you had crutches.
Right.
Um, that'd be an example of some. Again, I just think generally speaking, most businesses are going to try and accommodate you, and when you're in that kind of unfortunate situation, you have to understand that there's certain things you're just not going to be able to do. Um, there's going to occasionally be places where, you know, you're out of luck. Um,
Well, yeah, I
and
mean, there's obviously some things, to where, I mean, by its very nature, I mean, obviously, that you just can't do. I mean, someone who, is in. I mean, I think a lot of people can recognize that, but in trying to make areas more accessible, I mean, that's uh, again, I mean, first off, that would be a noble thing, but I recognize that moral and legal don't have the same distinctions or anything like that. But where you can, I do think it would be good for businesses to do that. And like I said, I think that's where you could ask. I think you could address that by saying, okay, what is would this be an undue burden upon this business to say, here's what you can do to make an accommodation for someone who's physically disabled?
it sort of strikes me as, I mean, people say you can't legislate morality, which, I mean, technically, saying you can't murder somebody is legislating morality. But there
Yeah,
are
I've never
certain
understood that argument.
there are certain instances where you can't legislate morality because things just get a little more complicated than the law is able to properly address. I mean, by nature, the law has to be a pretty black and white thing. The civil law has to generally be pretty black and white, and there are things that are a bit more complicated than that. So this would be kind of one of those instances where I'm like, this is sort of the kind of moral issue where I just don't think the state is equipped to get involved.
Yeah. Yeah, I
And
mean, I,
generally,
I
I
think
think,
that's a fair point. I mean, I think I think we're approaching this because I think you see the abuses on one side. I think I'm seeing the abuses on the other side, and so the answer is there really isn't a perfect answer.
I think I see the abuses on the other side. I just think they're a bit easier to deal with. if you find out that this one restaurant, doesn't want crippled people in there, and doesn't feel like, putting an easy to put in wheelchair ramp in, a lot of people aren't going to go to that restaurant anymore.
Yeah.
That seems like it's a bit easier to solve. The PR nightmare that would ensue, in cases where, business owners are not being reasonable about it, seems like the better way to police it.
I mean, I could certainly see that, and like I said, I mean, I think that's a fair point. So I mean, like I said, I get that. So that's the very same point that I hold when it comes to the other things. Like, again, if a Christian doesn't want to make a gay wedding cake, then that's fine. They should have the freedom to do that. And then that gay person, though, has the freedom to go and say, this person won't make a wedding cake. They don't support marriage equality. And so, all of my friends don't go to that store. Fine. I don't care. And like that's the thing. Like, you can look at like Target's bathroom thing and you can say that it's stupid, or you can say the people boycotting it's stupid or anything like that. But from a legal perspective, I don't have a problem with it. If Target wants to say, hey, anybody's welcome in our bathrooms, fine. And then the people who say, you know what, I'm going to boycott Target, fine. Like, from my opinion, both of that is okay legally.
It has hurt. It's funny too, generally when leftists try to boycott something, it doesn't work out well for them. Like, a lot of these places cave at the threat of the boycott because the boycott gets so much coverage. But at the end of the day, when the numbers are crunched, it doesn't tend to hurt them that much. I mean, they threaten boycott on Chick-fil-A, for example, and they, continue to go strong. Meanwhile, Target has actually been significantly hurt from this.
Yeah, and I mean, then Target has to ask the question, okay, do we stick to our values or do we cave to the numbers? And, again, whatever they choose is fine. I mean, like I said, if they want to say, well, we're going to stick to our progressive, whatever agenda, okay, fine, you're just going to have to lose the money, and that's okay, that's totally fair. Versus if they say, well, you know what, screw our agenda, we care about the money, so we're going to change it. Okay, cool, I mean, but again, from a legal standpoint, I don't have a problem at all, either with what Target's doing or what the people are doing. I think businesses should be allowed to decide their own bathroom policy, and the government should stay out of that.
I still shop at Target because, like, I won't go back to the Walmart. I won't go back to it. The Walmart in my area is so awful. It's so bad. I won't go back there.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'll go to, like I said, I don't go to the bathroom at Target, but I will, I shop there occasionally. My wife loves Target. So, but I don't really care. I mean, I don't know, Walmart, Target, and tit for tat. I don't care.
No,
I do a lot of shopping on Amazon at this point anyway.
My area, at least, there's a big difference.
Yeah.
Man, it's night and day. And it's weird,
too. I mean, I've got a Walmart that's about 20 minutes from me versus Target, which is about 50 minutes. So,
well, the Target and Walmart are literally like a quarter mile down the road from each other.
Yeah, see, it's not like that out here in the country.
Well, I'm still kind of out in the country. I mean, I have to drive about a half an hour to get anywhere. Other than like a Burger King and a grocery store.
Yeah. Yeah, the exciting thing here is we got a Dollar General.
Yeah, there's a Dollar General over here too.
Yeah.
Dollar Generals just pop up in the middle of damn nowhere.
Yeah, they really do. It's there's some nice ones, but then there's some ones that are just completely like no one cares like who's working there. I mean, they're just terrible. But like the one here, it's new, and so it's right now. It's really nice.
There's one when I'm heading down to Maryland, because I mean, I could basically spit to the Maryland border. But I mean, when you go further south in Lancaster County than I am, you're really in the middle of nowhere. And I mean, I'm driving along, and there's basically nothing but fields, and then there's this really nice new Dollar General with a reasonably big parking lot just out in the middle of nowhere. And I'm who is even working there? Do people live here? What is
No, like it's true. Well, I mean, there's this one place that's about 20 minutes from where I live, and they used to have a Walmart Express there, but it went out of business, and then Dollar General bought that and then put a Dollar General there.
It's like that Simpsons bit where there was the Krusty Burger on the unmanned oil rig.
Yeah.
Oh, Lordy.
But But yeah, no, I mean, as far as like I said, when it comes to the Johnson Amendment, to me it was just kind of like, nah. And the thing is, from my perspective too, I mean, I don't get into politics too much from the pulpit. I'll talk about some of the issues, but in terms of who to vote for, who not to vote for, I oftentimes don't get into that because I recognize that there's some. I mean, if you really want to divide a church very quickly, start getting into politics. Um, and I mean, my church, we have such a stance. I know that's not the case for every church, but I mean, our church has such a firm stance against politics in the church that we won't even allow our church to be used for voting to take place there. Like, even that's within which that's something that we could do because obviously, to allow like your fellowship hall to be used for like, votes to take place and that kind of stuff. We won't even do that because they want to be that separate from the politics. That's even written into its bylaws.
Well, generally, I mean, you gotta watch, when you're at the pulpit that, you're not giving your opinion on things. You're trying to give God's word.
Yeah. And I mean, at the end, I mean, from my point of view, people have got to follow their conscience. And there's some people who just, in good conscience could not vote for Donald Trump. And even if you disagree with them, it's like, that's still your conscience. But I think it would be an abuse of my authority to stand up there and say, you should vote for Donald Trump from the pulpit. That's the wrong place to say that. I could say that maybe, talking to them one-on-one or something like that. But from that position, to me, that's an abuse of my power. That's an abuse of that platform. Because at that point, that is where I am supposed to push on a person's conscience is from the pulpit, in my opinion. And so I shouldn't push on their conscience unless it's coming from the word of God.
Yeah, I agree with that. Generally speaking, I think a preacher shouldn't be getting into that. But I'd also like the government to leave that to them.
Well, I mean, look, I'm all for the government staying out of things. Like I said, I mean, I'm someone, and I mean, and this is just I think my most consistent position is any power you give to the government to do one thing, you always need to wonder, and I think almost understand that it's eventually going to be used against you. That's why I'm like, let's limit the government as much as possible, and just allow people to do things on their own. Because I guess that's just always my view of government is whatever, power you give them, how can it be used against you?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, as much as libertarianism has become a joke, I mean, where it's about nothing but weed and buttholes these days. I mean, I still lean heavily libertarian in just my overall temperament, and I generally err on the side of leaving people the hell alone.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm from a legal standpoint, I'm all for that. I mean, like we've talked about this before, and we talked about like the transgender issue. We talked about it from a moral perspective, but I mean, legally, we were, agreed. Look, if you want to, if you're a guy and you want to put on a dress and say, hey, call me Samantha instead of Sam now, said legally, yeah, sure, fine. You're within your own, within your rights to do that, right? But don't then demand that I have to call you Samantha now too, or whatever name you want to take on for yourself today. And of course, morally repent, get help.
I identify as a Bulbasaur, so
yeah.
And I demand my own Bulbasaur bathroom at the Target.
What would that even look like?
I don't know. Probably look like it's just like a bunch of bushes, I guess you piss into. I don't know. They just tell you to use the bushes outside.
Well, but I mean, Bulbasaur is kind of a bush, so I mean, you're kind of peeing on yourself at that point.
He's a plant monster, so I guess it's got to be a bunch of plants. I don't know. But yeah, I just generally I think it's a good sign because it shows that he's leaning in a certain direction. And it shows that. I mean, certainly under the Obama administration, we know for a fact that the IRS was used against political enemies, and this is Trump just publicly saying that people on the right don't need to fear the IRS going after them for political reasons. So in that sense, it's a good signaling to his allies.
Well, no, I mean, too many people on the right are far too cowardly. Like the Republicans, with the government shutdown, we gave way too much with that to try to avoid a government shutdown just because they're so afraid of, what the media is going to say about them at this point. You know,
Well, I don't think, and I don't think a government shutdown is going to, like, look,
who
back in
cares?
95, Anti-Dem pointed this out. He was dead right. Back in 95, the showdown between Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton didn't go well for the Republicans when there was a government shutdown. But that was back when the left had way more control of the media. This was not only pre-internet, this was pre-Fox News. And also, who was the more photogenic and charming guy there? This was Bill Clinton at the height of his charm, and this was Newt Gingrich. So, yeah, who's going to win this, battle for the hearts and minds of the people here? I mean, nowadays you got Trump, and you think the media is going to outwit him finally? Like this time they'll do it? No, he should have pushed for a shutdown.
Right, and absolutely. And again, if anything, it's like it teaches people, maybe you don't need the government as much as they want you to think you do.
Yeah. And, I mean, there was a shutdown a couple years ago. I think Ted Cruz helped basically push it into happening, like back in 2013 or something like that. And nothing happened. Nobody cared.
No, Obama had to shut down some parks to just make it
make people care. He actually spent extra money to like close off monuments and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, that's how unaffected the American people were by the government shutdowns. Like, who cares? I mean, really, what's changed? Ooh.
And
so stop getting in. I mean, come on,
I remember a few years ago I was arguing on this channel that the right should just pull the trigger and try to impeach Obama. And, everybody knee-jerk reaction is like, oh, it'll go so terribly for him because it went so terribly for him when they impeached Clinton. I'm like, did it? Because last I checked, in the next election cycle, they got increased control of the Congress and the presidency. So I don't know where this myth that impeaching Obama was this disaster for the Republicans.
No, I mean, when the left does things, people hate it. But when the right does it, the problem with the right is that they don't do anything. And so people are just like, well, I'd rather have the left doing something than the right doing nothing.
Yeah, and they don't stand by it when they try and do something. They just, conservatives have done nothing but surrender for 50, 60 years here.
Yeah, it's stupid.
And every one of these conservatives were like, oh, I don't like Trump. He's just so, rude and stuff like that. And I'm like, what has your ilk managed to conserve in 50 years? Because right now you haven't even managed to conserve the ladies' room.
Well, and I mean, it's like, yes, Trump's course, but again, have you noticed who he's going against?
Well, and Undertow put it best on here when he said that there were a lot of people on the old right in particular, and some of the religious right and all, that they just could not distinguish between manners and morality. They think Trump's this, over on that Breakpoint site, they're like, I hope he's a better president than he is a man. Like, they just think he's this terrible, as a man, he's terrible. They never said that about like Obama. They never said that about George W. Bush, both of whom have darker secrets in their past than Trump. What's the big sin you could point to with Trump is that he likes vagina, which maybe in the current year is a sin for a man, but I don't know. I mean, he's okay. He's been divorced a couple of times, and that's no good. But despite going through, a broken home basically, and raising children in incredible opulence, he's managed to raise very well-adjusted children, which is more than Obama can say. And it's more than W can say.
Oh, yeah. Well, of course, my big thing is that, a lot of those who had those problems for that reason, they didn't have it because they actually feel like divorce is wrong or anything like that. They had it because of what the left was going to say. That was why they didn't want to. We just know the left is just going to, hound the, how can you support someone who's against a divorce? And that was really more of the motivation behind it. It wasn't like, no, we actually feel divorce is wrong, so we're not going to vote for somebody who, has been divorced 3 times. It's, we don't want to hear it from the left. And so that's why we're not going to vote. We don't want to vote for him because we don't want to be,
some of them. I think with some of them, particularly the some of the more religious right types, which I almost hate using that term because it's kind of retro, but I don't know what else to call them. But it's almost like they were like they basically hated Trump for the same reason Ted Knight's character hated Rodney Dangerfield's in Caddyshack. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, I can't believe he said that. He's just so rude. You know, it again, it's just not understanding the difference between manners and morality here. You know,
Right.
They were basically Ted Knight and Caddyshack. You know, they were pearl clutchers. I mean, there's no other term for it. You know, I
Yeah, I
can't
mean,
think
you
of
know,
a
if
better way
you
to put it.
again, you have your issues with Trump and fine. I mean, you know, I think again, he's not a perfect guy, obviously, but you know, certainly, like you said, far better than the alternative. And again, yeah, there's a big difference between someone being uncouth and being coarse and everything like that versus someone who is, you know, has no interest in anything, but he's polite.
Yeah,
You know, anything of virtue, but he just happens to be polite. And that's the problem again is, you know, unfortunately, so many people on the right are more interested in appearances. You know, well, as long as you appear nice, you know, well, then we'll think you're nice versus if you appear to be uncouth or something like that. And, you know, that matters, but then you also have to learn how to look a little bit deeper than that.
yes, a perfect example is W. I mean, look, Trump, he's hardly a perfect man, but by any kind of moral stretch, he is a better man than George W. Bush. When you look at George W. Bush's past, when you look at the kind of president he was, when you look at the two daughters he's raised, Trump is the better man by any kind of moral measure. But appearance wise, George W. Bush is more palatable. So, you know, the more religious right types, they adored George W. Bush, adored him, and despised Trump.
All right.
Well, I mean, Trump has almost already done more for pro-life causes than George W. Bush did in 8 years. But you know, Trump's wife posed in a nudie mag one time or something. You know, it's all surface stuff.
Yeah.
You know, and again, I think really the type of kids you raise is a keen indicator. I mean, it's not the only indicator. You know, you can be a near perfect parent and your kid become a train wreck. Human beings have free will. But still, the type of kids you raise is a pretty good indicator. And George and W's daughters are train wrecks. Meanwhile, you know, the worst you can say about any of Trump's kids is that Tiffany has had a bit too much party in her past. Nothing like the Bush twins, but she's had a bit too much fun. And you know, Ivanka likes to run off at the mouth with a bunch of liberal bullshit from time to time. But other than that, incredibly well-adjusted kids. And you know, you compare that to W's two, you know, girls gone wild daughters, or you know, despite being rich and opulent and the most powerful man in the world, Obama's basically raised two twerking hood rats. That says something to the kind of man they are. And you know, but again, only concerned with surface stuff. You know, don't want to actually talk about that kind of thing.
Well, and of course, I mean, again, a lot of people will end up, you know, even though the media's lied about everything else. Oh, well, about Trump though, they're telling the truth, and it's like, I mean, again, why would you, you know, when they've lied about so many other things, why would you then just suddenly believe them, you know, because of Donald Trump, like what they have to say about him? Why would you not automatically? I mean, again, especially when they've lied about you.
Well, again, they were put off by Trump just on a temperament issue, just on a surface, you know. And Glenn Beck was the best example. And I realize he's not an evangelical, but I guess he sort of fits in culturally with that religious right mindset. But he was a perfect example. Glenn Beck was triggered by Trump when Trump gave his announcement speech. You know, when nobody thought this was anything that was going to go anywhere. Glenn Beck was already triggered by Trump and like, oh, he's too arrogant to be the president. He doesn't, you know, I mean, he was already rambling on and like making up stories and crap like that. Like the next day, he actually took a clip out of context from one of Trump's either announcement speech or earliest speeches, where Trump said, one of the reasons you should vote for me, like early on, was I'm rich as hell. And that means that no one can buy me. So Glenn Beck played the clip and said, one of the reasons you should vote for me is I'm rich as hell. And that was it. Making it sound like Trump was just bragging about his wealth, you know, like a big dick measuring contest, when he was making the argument that like, I am beyond being bribed.
Right.
which is a very that's a pretty good point in your favor. I mean, what lobbyist is going to bribe Trump? Uh, you know,
Well, that's true. I mean,
so,
um, I don't know. I mean, again, it's so obvious. Just the level of unfairness with Trump that I mean, even people now, like regular average Joe people, can see it. Like, have you heard the joke? I heard this from someone who is actually a registered Democrat about Trump and the Pope on a boat.
mm-mm. No, I
All
didn't hear
right,
it.
so Trump and the Pope are sitting there on a boat, right? And the wind comes and it knocks off the Pope's hat, and so it lands in the water, right? His big Pope hat.
Mm-hmm.
And so Trump gets out of the boat, starts walking on the water, goes and grabs the hat, gets back in the boat, and then hands it to the Pope. And everyone's like really amazed and everything like that. But you know what the headlines read the next day?
What?
Trump can't swim.
uh,
I mean, it's like, golly. The reason why it's funny is because you can just see them doing that, especially with the whole, he got 2 scoops of ice cream. How dare him?
oh my gosh. I like what the one guy, like, I think it was that Nick Nolte guy, that CNN is Hitler guy on Twitter. I think he had a tweet where he's like, I'm pretty sure if somebody would have asked, they could have had 2 scoops.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, did the other people want 2 scoops? I mean,
Well, I mean, from what I at least according to Michael Savage, Trump is known to basically serve you ice cream against your will. Like, that's just his attempt to be nice to you if you're a guest. Like, here's some ice cream. You didn't ask for ice cream, but you're getting ice cream.
see, Trump should have responded back. Stop fat shaming me.
Well, I like the one tweet or the one like Photoshop where he's holding the cone and it's like 1.5 feet tall of scoops. And he's like, I'll have as much damn ice cream as I please. But yeah, that's CNN. Like, oh, Trump had 2 scoops of ice cream. Like, yeah.
There wasn't anything better to report on that day, apparently.
At this point, I couldn't fault Trump morally if he just shot a missile at CNN headquarters. Was like, it was North Korea. You finally got one of those missiles over here.
Oh
Press
man,
F.
yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know how we could do that without, really screwing up with some freedom. But gosh, I wish there was a way to just hold the media accountable to some of their garbage. Like, there was a way to do that without like having to violate certain freedoms.
Well, that is just in general, that is the great challenge the West faces, is cutting out the leftist cancer while preserving as much of our freedoms as possible.
Yeah.
It's like chemo. I mean, you have to, you got to try and minimize the loss of good tissue.
Yeah.
But the longer you let it metastasize, the more good tissue is bound to be lost in the process.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, there's times I find myself wishing Trump was the monster the left makes him out to be. Oh no, Rachel Maddow was mysteriously killed by, I think it was ISIS. Yeah, it was definitely ISIS.
Well, I mean,
She's definitely got a chemo.
it's just, golly. I mean, you think about just some of these kids, right, who just throw away their lives because they've been fed this garbage by the media and all this kind of stuff, and they get arrested, and so now they get a record because they're out doing some sort of Antifa stuff. And granted, I'm holding them accountable too for their stupid choice, but the media people who are sitting in their air-conditioned rooms and all this kind of stuff, they should be held accountable too for the influence that they had on that kid.
Oh yeah. And you gotta use some RICO laws and just go after George Soros and those types of guys funding this crap.
Yeah.
You need to treat these groups like the domestic terrorist organizations that they are. I mean, the left, when they're in charge of the government, they'll send ATF agents in to go after right-wing weirdos in a cabin, not bothering anybody just because they stockpiled a few too many bullets. So maybe it's about time we start returning the favor on their extremist groups.
Oh, but leftists can't be extreme just because they're leftist.
Well, I think we've rambled on for long enough. Any kind of closing thoughts like throw in there, Pastor John?
Well, again, just hope everyone had a good Sunday today, and so I appreciate you having me on, allowing us to just kind of talk a little bit more about Islam. I know that when you're discussing it in the moment, it can things cannot always get articulated the best. So I'm glad that after you had a chance, especially for me, after I had a chance to really think about things and I could better sort of present where I was coming from. And so, I know we don't exactly agree, but I think we kind of realize that we're where the disagreement is and just kind of why the disagreement's there. You know what I'm saying?
Well, it's always great having you on the channel. I always appreciate having you on here. Yeah. So, all right. Well, folks, if you enjoy the live stream, do check out the tip jar down below where, you can send me some shekels. That's greatly appreciated. And other than that, that's about all we got for tonight, folks. Thanks for listening. Bechtloff out.